For this section of the course, we will be discussing Excel's pivot tables. And pivot tables are one of the most powerful features inside of Microsoft Excel. Pivot tables allows us to extract significant data from a large detailed data set. So basically, we can create a summarized list of our data that we have interest in. And pivot tables come with many great features such as building reports, sorting, filtering, grouping, and the list goes on. And in the next few videos, we will cover some of these features, but for this lecture, we are going to focus on how we can create and insert a pivot table inside of our worksheet. So before we begin, I want to point out that we are working inside the Pivot Tables Sheet tab. So make sure that you have this tab selected. And just a quick tip, I know we have a lot of sheet tabs inside this workbook, and it might be tedious at times to use this arrow to scroll through the sheet tabs, but if you give this arrow a right click, it will give us a list of all the sheet tabs inside this workbook, and we can select the sheet that we want to activate. Our pivot table sheet is already selected, so I'm going to click OK. Now in order to create a pivot table, the first thing that we have to do is select our data. So what we can do is click any cell within our data set and then use the keyboard shortcut Control-A or Command-A if you're on Mac. And this will select all the data within our data set. And then we can come up to the Insert tab and select Pivot Table. And if we look inside this pop-up window, we can choose the location where we want to place our table. In this first box, shows the range of cells that include our data, so that's good. And then down here, we could either choose to insert our pivot table on a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. For this example, I'm going to select Existing Worksheet, and for the location, we can click inside this box and select a cell on this current worksheet. So that way we can have our data set and our pivot table on the same worksheet. So I'm going to select cell J2 and click OK. Now that we got our pivot table inserted into our spreadsheet, we have two new tabs within our ribbon, which are Pivot Table Analyze and Design. And we also have a Pivot Table Fields window pop up on the right side of our screen. And here's where we can select and rearrange our data for our pivot table. And if you noticed, these labels right here are the same as our column headers within our data set. So it's important to have headers within your data set when you're working with pivot tables. So let's start to create our first pivot table report. Let's say that we want to sum up all the cells for each product ID. Well, we can come over back to our fields window, and down here we have four different areas: filters, columns, rows, and values. And this is where we can drag our fields to rearrange our pivot table report. So let's just check cells and see what happens. Excel automatically put the cells within the values area. And up here in our report, it says that the sum of cells is $51,526. So automatically, Excel summed all the cells within the cells column. But we want to see the total cells for each product ID. And if we take a look at our product ID column, we can see that we have a product ID of D104, A101, D104, D104. So there's multiple product ID numbers, but they also get repeated. So what pivot tables can do is group these product IDs together and then sum the cells for each unique product ID. So if we select product ID, it automatically put it in the rows area. And now if we look at our report, we can easily tell that the sum of cells for the product ID of A101 was 10,470. And for the product of B102, the cells were 18,901, and so on. and then it also gives us a grand total of all the cells combined. So that's how you can create a pivot table. It's very quick and simple to do, and it can give us a lot of detailed information about our data. And over the next few videos, we'll start to discuss how we can modify, group, filter, and other neat features that pivot tables come with to reveal the advantages and benefits when it comes to utilizing pivot tables to build sophisticated reports. Alright, now that we got our pivot table in our spreadsheet, we can start to apply some modifications to our report. So in the previous video, when we checked cells, by default, Excel automatically added to the values box, and then summed all the values to get the total amount of cells. Well, the reason why it did that is because Excel knows that the cells column has numeric data. So Excel assumed that we wanted to sum those values. But let's say that we dragged one of our fields in the values box that only included text values. What will Excel do then? Well, let's try it out. Let's uncheck the cells and the product ID, and this time we can drag product ID to the values box. So instead of Excel automatically applying a sum, it applied a count, because we can't sum text values. And up here in our report, it shows that the total count of all the products combined is 99. And if we wanted to see the count for each unique product ID, we can drag the product ID to the rows box as well. So let's do that. Now in our pivot table, we can see the count of each product ID. Now let's change this pivot table back to where we could see the total cells for each product ID. We can remove the product ID out of the values box by just clicking and dragging up. And then to get the cells back in there, we can click cells and drag it to the values. And once again, since the cells column has numeric data in it, Excel automatically applied a sum for our cells. So currently in our report, our cells column has no formatting applied to it. So it's a little bit hard to read these values. But luckily, we can apply number formatting to our report, just like how we can format cells within our worksheet. So to do that, we can come down to the sum of cells in our values box, give it a left click, and select Value Field Settings. And in our pop-up window, we can select Number Format. And since we are dealing with money, I'm going to select the currency format. And then we can click OK. OK again. Now in our pivot table, the sum of cells column has the currency format. We also have the option to change what this report does to the cells column. Currently, it's summing all the cells for each product ID. Well, instead of using sum, what if we wanted the average of the cells for each product ID? So to change that, we can left click our sum of cells in our values box, go back to Value Field Settings, and in our pop-up window, we have the choice to sum, count, average, max, min, and so on. So if we wanted to average our cells, we can select average and click OK. Now our pivot table is averaging the cells for each product ID. I'm going to press Ctrl Z on my keyboard to undo that action to get back where our pivot table is summing the cells for each product ID. Now let's take a look at our data set. We have this units column that shows how many units were sold for that product ID. So if we wanted to make our report a little bit more detailed, we can include the total units sold for each product. So what we have to do is click anywhere back inside of our pivot table, and then we can select our units and drag it to the values box. Now our pivot table shows the total cells and the total amount of units of each product ID. Well, if we wanted, instead of summing the amount of units for each product, we can show this value as a percentage of the grand total. So if we left click the sum of units in our values box, go to Value Field Settings, and then we can click the Show Values As tab, And then within this dropdown, we have multiple options to choose from. And for our example, we can select % of grand total. Then click OK. Now our pivot table is showing the percentage of how many units were sold for each product ID. And currently in our pivot table, it is sorting by the product ID alphabetically. But if we wanted to see the largest cells to the smallest cells, we can select our sum of cells column, come up to the Data tab, and select the descending sort, which is largest to smallest. Now we can easily see that the product B102 has the highest amount of cells, and product A101 has the lowest. So those were a few options how we can modify our pivot tables. Play around with it, drag different fields to these quadrants down below, and see how your pivot table changes. And in the next video, we will talk about how we can group and filter data within our pivot table. Alright, now that we have seen a few ways how to modify our pivot table, now we are going to discuss how we can group and filter within our pivot table. Okay, so within our report, let's say that we want to see some date values so we can see when these products were sold. So over here in our fields window, we can check date. Alright, so a few things have happened here. Even though that we selected date, Excel created a new field called date parentheses month. Now depending on what version of Excel you have, it may do this automatically, but if it doesn't, I will show you how to get this field here shortly. So Excel created this new field to try to be helpful, because Excel knows that we have a bunch of different date values within our date column in our data set, and if it included every date value, this report would be very congested and hard to read. So it automatically took all of our date values and grouped them into months. Now our report is a little hard to read at the moment because we are getting the sum of sales and the percentage of units for each month. So for now, we can deselect units so that way we can see the sales for each product for each month. And since that we have more months than we do products, I think this report would look better if we switched our column labels with our row labels. So we can drag the date month field over to the rows area, and then we can grab the product ID and move it to the columns area. Now this report is a lot simpler to read. We have our months in our row labels, and then we have our product IDs in the column labels. And we can see for each month what the total amount of sales were for each product, and the grand total of sales for that month. So like I said before, if your version of Excel doesn't automatically group the date values into months, it might look something like this. I'm going to drag the date field down to the rows area and deselect the date month. So if your report looks like this, with each individual date value in the row labels, you can select any value within this column, give it a right click, and select Group. And then we can tell Excel what to group it by, so we can select Months and click OK. Now you should have the Date Month field, and Excel put it in the rows area. And the reason why our report is bold now with a bunch of little plus signs next to our months, since we manually grouped our date values into months, if we click one of these plus signs next to our month, it will expand and show every date value within that month. So if you were interested in seeing the total sales for a specific date, this would be a good option. But if you were just interested in the total sales for the month, you can just collapse all the months, or you can deselect the date value and just keep the date month field in our rows area. Now if we wanted to see the total sales for each quarter instead of each month, we can do that by just clicking a cell within the column that you want to group, give it a right click, and select Group. And instead of months, we can select quarters. And I'm going to deselect months and click OK. So once again, now Excel added another date field, but this date field is by quarter. And it added it to our rows area, and now our report just shows the total sales for each quarter. So that's how we can group data inside of our pivot tables. We can also filter data as well. So let's deselect the date by quarter and put in the date by month again. Now, one way to filter is that pivot tables automatically come with a drop-down arrow, and if we click this, we can select which months that we want to filter. For example, if we only wanted to see January, February, and March, we can deselect all the checkboxes and just select January, February, and March. And if we click OK, now our report only shows those 3 months. Now we can clear that filter by clicking the filter button and select Clear Filter. Now another way to filter inside of our pivot tables is to drag one of these fields into the filter area. So once again, if we wanted to filter by the month, we can select our month field and drag it down to the filters. Well, if we look at our report, we can tell that this didn't work. It's because it removed the month field that was in our rows area and put it in our filters, because we can't have the same field in our rows area as we do in our filters area. What we could do to still be able to filter by month is to leave the months field within our filter area and then drag our date field into our rows area. And now what we can do is come up here to the top to where our pivot table added this new filter section, select this drop down and expand all, and then we can choose which months to filter. And this time, if we wanted to see April, May, and June, we can deselect all and just select April, May, June. And click OK. Now we can see the total sales for each date value within those 3 months. So depending on your needs and how you want to view your data, you have multiple options to choose from to how you can filter or group your data to your liking. Another feature that pivot tables have that I want to discuss with you really quickly is the drill down feature. And we can use the drill down feature to see the details that were used to come up with a total. So when we created this pivot table to summarize our data, each of these numbers in the values area represents one or more records in the pivot table source. So within our pivot table, we can select any of these numbers and drill down to see the details of these numbers. So for example, let's take the total sales of product A101 for the month of January. To drill down, all we have to do is double-click this cell. Now Excel created a new sheet and named it Sheet 1, and it also provided us with this table. And these are all the records that make up the total for the product A101 for the month of January. And if we select our sales column, we can see that this sums up to 1909 in our status bar. And if we go back to our pivot tables tab, the sum of sales for A101 for January is 1909. So this drill down feature can be really helpful if you want to see the details of a specific value. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if our data source updates and then we update our pivot table, this drill down sheet doesn't get updated. So in order to have the most recent changes, you have to make sure that you update your pivot table and then create a new drill down sheet. So once again, drilling down to see the specific details of a value inside of our pivot table is very easy to do. All it takes is a double click and it automatically filters the data for that value. So as we can see, using pivot tables allows us to create really organized and sophisticated table form reports. But another neat feature that comes with pivot tables is pivot charts. So not only can we see our data in table form, but we can present our data in chart form as well. So to insert a pivot chart, we can select any cell within our pivot table, then come up to the Pivot Table Analyze tab, and then select Pivot Chart. And then from here, we can select any chart that we want, but for this example, I'm just going to use the clustered column chart. So if we click OK, now we have inserted our pivot chart. Now the difference between pivot charts and regular charts that we have worked with earlier in the course is that if we change anything in our fields window, it will not only update our pivot table, but it will update our chart as well. And vice versa. Anything we change in our pivot chart using these filter buttons, it will update our pivot table as well. So our pivot table and our pivot chart are always connected. And let me show you what I mean by that. So let's say in this column chart, we want to have the different product IDs on the x-axis, and then show the amount of total sales for each product. So if we come over here to our fields window, we can select the month and drag that out. And then to get the product ID on the x-axis, we can move the product ID out of legend and move it to axis. So now our chart shows the total sales for each product ID. And the same goes for our pivot table. So both our pivot table and pivot chart updated. Now let's mess around with our different fields and see what ways we can view our data in chart form. So let's say that we wanted to see the total sales for each product by region. Well, all we have to do is select our region field and drag it down to our legend. And this added the legend to our chart that includes the regions, and then it also added the regions to our column labels in our pivot table. Now let's try to get our chart to show the total sales for each product for each quarter. So we can deselect region and then select the month, move our product ID to the legend, and then we need to group our months by quarter. And to do that, we need to select a month in the row labels, give it a right click, and select Group. And then we can select Quarters and click OK. Now we can see the total sales for each product by quarter. And if we wanted to apply filters to this chart, we can either apply a filter to the product ID or the quarters. For example, if I click this drop down, I can select which quarters I want to filter. So let's say we only want to see quarter 1 and 2. We can select those and click OK. And if we want to apply a filter to the product ID, we can select its filter button and then select the products that we want to show in our chart. Now our chart is showing the total sales for product A101 and B102 for quarters 1 and 2. And by applying these filters to our chart, it also applied the filters to our pivot table. And if I change the filters in our pivot table, it will do the same for our pivot chart. So that's one option we could use to filter data inside of our pivot table and pivot chart. Another option is to use slicers. Now before we insert a slicer, I do want to mention that slicers are only available for Excel 2016 and newer. And slicers can be located underneath the Pivot Table Analyze tab. And then we can select Insert Slicer. And then from here, we can select which slicers to insert. So if we want to have an option to filter by region, we can select region. And if we want to filter by the month, we can select month. And if we click OK, now Excel has inserted these slicers. So slicers allows us to easily filter data inside of our pivot table or pivot chart. For example, in our chart, on the x-axis, we have the quarters, and then we have the product IDs in the legend. So the month or a region is currently not in the chart or the pivot table, but we can still filter by the month and region because that data is still resting in our source. So for example, let's say I only want to see the total sales for the North region. I can click North, and now our table and chart only shows the data for the North region. And if I want to select multiple regions, I can click the Control key or the Command key if you're on Mac and select another region. So let's say that we want to see the North and South region. Now we're only seeing the data for those two regions. Another neat thing with slicers is that we can apply multiple filters at the same time. Right now we're seeing the data for the North and South region, but for all the months. So in our month slicer, we can select which months that we want to show in our chart. So let's say that we want to show January, and I can press the Control key or the Command key to select more months. So let's just select February and March. Now our table and chart only show data for the month of January, February, March for the North and South regions. And the reason why our chart only shows quarter one is because we only have January, February, and March selected, and all the other months are filtered out. So if we add April, May, and June, now it's showing quarter one and quarter two. And to clear these filters, all we have to do is click on the red X at the top right-hand corner of the slicer. And this will clear the filters. Slicers also come with a lot of formatting options as well. We can resize these slicers by clicking and dragging one of the endpoints. And underneath the Slicers tab, we can apply different styles to these slicers as well by clicking this drop down underneath Styles and then select the style that you prefer. So let's say that we want a dark blue color instead of a light blue. It's totally up to you. So that's how we can view our data in our pivot table in chart form. And within our chart, we can use the filter buttons or add slicers to filter our data. And whatever changes we make to the pivot table or the pivot chart, they will always be connected to each other, making our spreadsheets more dynamic.